Before we begin, welcome to Podcast Station, the place where real experiences, unexplained encounters, and stories from the wild are given the time they deserve to be heard. What you're about to listen to is a first-hand account, one shaped by isolation, fear, and decisions made far from help. Listen closely, and when the story ends, we invite you to share your thoughts. Have you experienced something similar, or do you have a story of your own? Leave a comment, subscribe to the channel, and become part of the conversation here at Podcast Station. The first time I realized the forest was listening to me, not just hearing but listening, was the night my breath fogged inside my jacket and the pines stopped moving all at once. I had been a ranger for a long time by then, long enough to believe that fear was something you learned to manage, like a tool you kept on your belt. Long enough to believe that every sound had a source, every shadow a cause, every missing hiker a reason that could be explained if you walked far enough and asked the right questions. That belief was the spine of my career. Without it, I would not have lasted a season, let alone decades. My name doesn't matter as much as the badge I wore. I was in my early 40s when these things began to converge, old enough to be trusted by the locals, young enough to still take the night shifts myself. I worked a remote stretch of protected forest in the northern Rockies, a place most people only knew as a green smear on a map. Locals called it by older names. Names they did not explain. Names they spoke quietly as if the trees themselves had opinions about being named at all. The forest was my workplace, but it was also my companion. I knew the trails by the way the ground dipped under my boots. I knew the weather by how the air tasted at dawn. Pine sap, wet stone, cold iron. That was the language of my days. The job was simple in theory. Protect the land, protect the people, make sure both survived each other. In practice, it meant long nights, short conversations, and learning to read fear in the eyes of hikers who swore they were fine until they weren't. The locals were a different matter. They lived near the tree line, or just beyond it, in cabins that leaned like old men and trucks that never quite died. They respected the forest the way you respect something that can kill you without meaning to. They did not romanticize it. When they warned me about certain places, they did not do it with drama. They did it the way you tell someone not to touch a hot stove. "Don't go near the old cave system after dark," one man told me once, eyes fixed on his coffee. "And don't follow sounds that don't have a body." I laughed then, not mockingly, just comfortably. The kind of laugh that comes from a man who believes he understands the rules of his world. The first incident was small, almost forgettable. A routine call about a broken trail marker near a ridge that overlooked a narrow valley choked with pines. I went alone, as I often did. The sky was clear, the air sharp with the promise of snow. Nothing felt wrong until I realized how quiet it was. Not peaceful quiet, vacant quiet. No birds, no wind. Even my boots sounded wrong, too loud, like the forest had stopped absorbing sound and was reflecting it back at me. That was when I heard the knock. It came from somewhere ahead of me, deep in the trees. 3 sharp, deliberate impacts, not woodpecker fast, not branch on branch random. It sounded like knuckles on a door. I stopped walking. The sound did not repeat. I waited longer than I should have, listening for the rational follow-up my mind demanded. It never came. Eventually I moved on, repaired the marker, and told myself it was ice shifting inside a tree. The explanation fit well enough to sleep on. But sleep, I learned, is not the same as rest. The second incident involved sound again, but closer. Too close. A search and rescue call for a solo camper who hadn't checked in. I found his campsite intact. Fire cold, tent zipped, boots lined up neatly outside like he planned to step back into them. I called his name into the trees and heard it come back to me. Not as an echo, as a response. It was my voice, but slower, wrong in the mouth, like someone learning to shape the sound of language for the first time. I stood there with my radio buzzing against my chest, my heart trying to climb out of my throat, and understood something fundamental had shifted. The forest was no longer a backdrop. It was participating. I told no one about that part. I logged the camper as missing, expanded the search radius, followed procedure. But procedure does not account for the feeling of being watched by something that does not blink. As weeks passed, the stories layered themselves onto my routine like frost. A hunter who smelled rot where there should have been snow. A hiker who swore the ground felt warm under her hands near a cave entrance, like a living body. A local kid who said something tall and pale stood between the trees and watched him walk home without ever moving its legs. I handled these reports the way I always had: calm voice, steady notes, reassurance that fear exaggerates memory. And yet every time I passed the caves, my chest tightened. The air grew colder there, but not in the way cold usually works. It pressed inward. It crept under my gloves and lingered on my skin as if it recognized me. The cave was old, older than the park, older than the maps. It breathed when the temperature shifted, exhaling damp air that smelled of stone and something faintly animal. Locals said it was a place where sound went to die. I began to suspect it was where sound went to wait. The night everything changed. I was called out alone again. A report of lights moving between the trees. Not flashlights, not vehicles. Something steady and low, like eyes learning how to glow. As I followed the trail, the forest closed in, branches knitting overhead until the sky was gone. My radio crackled, then went silent. That was when I heard my name. Not shouted, not whispered, spoken the way you say something you've always known. The fear did not arrive suddenly. It unfolded inside me, layer by layer, peeling away my certainty, my training, my faith in explanations. I realized, standing there with my hand on my sidearm, that the forest had been patient. It had watched me rationalize every warning, every story, every instinct. And now it was my turn to listen. I did not answer when it said my name. That choice, small, instinctive, may be the only reason I am still alive to tell this. Silence, I would later learn, was the last boundary I had control over. The light I had been following dimmed and slid sideways between the trunks, not bobbing like a headlamp, not swaying like a lantern. It moved with intention, gliding just above the forest floor, casting no shadow I could see. The pines around me began to creak, not from wind, but from weight, as if something unseen was leaning against them, testing their strength. My breath came out shallow. The cold no longer felt external. It was inside my chest, tightening around my lungs. I told myself not to panic. Panic gets people killed. That was a rule I had lived by. But fear, real fear, does not ask permission. It slips past rules. I could feel my body preparing to run, even as my mind tried to catalog details. Distance to the trailhead, radio dead zone, direction of the slope. Survival math. Then the sound changed. Behind me, far off at first, came the slow crunch of footsteps. Too slow for a deer, too heavy for a man walking carefully. Each step landed with a pause between, as if whoever or whatever was moving needed time to remember how legs worked. The scent hit me next. A thick, wet smell, like old fur left too long in the rain, mixed with iron and something sweet that turned my stomach. I turned, sweeping my flashlight in a wide arc. The beam caught bark, brush, fog, nothing else. The footsteps stopped the moment I stopped moving, as if we were tethered by the same invisible line. I took one step backward. The forest answered with one step forward. That was when denial finally cracked. I had spent years telling myself that stories were stories because people needed shapes for their fear. Standing there, alone, in a place that suddenly felt too narrow to contain me, I understood that sometimes fear is the shape of the truth pressing through. I moved uphill, angling away from the caves, keeping my pace steady despite the way my muscles screamed to bolt. The light ahead vanished entirely. Darkness filled in the space it left, thick and absolute. The footsteps followed, closer now. I could feel them through the ground, a vibration that traveled up my legs and settled behind my eyes. Then I heard breathing. It was not loud. It was not aggressive. It was patient, a deep, controlled intake and release, as if whatever followed me had all the time in the world. My own breathing felt frantic by comparison, ragged and shallow. I forced myself to slow it, counting the seconds in my head. 4 in, 4 out, training over terror. The trail narrowed near a rock outcrop, and that was where it brushed against me. Not grabbed, not struck, brushed. Something coarse dragged along the back of my jacket, just enough pressure to be unmistakable. The contact sent a shock through me, so sharp my vision blurred. I stumbled forward, caught myself on the rock, and turned, the flashlight shaking in my hand. The beam landed on a shape that should not have existed. It stood taller than any man I had ever seen, hunched beneath the trees, its outline blurred, not by motion but by depth, like looking at something through water. Pale hair hung in wet strands from its shoulders, clotted with mud and leaves. Its face, or what passed for one, was partially obscured by shadow, but I could see enough to know it was wrong. The proportions were off, the mouth too wide, the eyes set too far back, reflecting my light with a dull animal sheen. It did not rush me. It did not roar. It simply watched. I raised my weapon without conscious thought, hands moving on training alone. The weight of it felt suddenly symbolic, a gesture more than a defense. The thing tilted its head, mimicking the motion with unsettling precision. When it opened its mouth, the sound that came out was not a growl. It was a breathy imitation of my voice. It said my name again, closer this time, the syllables stretched and warped, as if spoken by a throat not built for them. Panic surged, hot and overwhelming. I fired once, the report deafening in the closed forest. The muzzle flash lit the trees in stark white, freezing the moment into something unreal. When the light faded, the thing was gone. The silence that followed was worse than any noise. My ears rang. The smell of gunpowder mixed with the rot sweet scent, lingering longer than it should have. I stood there shaking, scanning every direction, waiting for the forest to retaliate. It didn't. I retreated the rest of the way in a near run, not stopping until the trees thinned and the sky opened back up above me. By the time I reached my truck, my hands were numb, my jaw locked tight enough to ache. I sat there with the engine running, headlights cutting uselessly into the dark, and felt something fundamental break inside me. I filed the report the next morning. Discharged weapon. No visual confirmation of threat. Possible bear encounter under poor visibility conditions. The words felt hollow even as I wrote them. My supervisor read it without comment, then looked at me for a long moment that said more than any reprimand. "Take a few days," he said quietly. "You look like you need them." I did not tell him what I saw. I did not tell anyone. But the forest knew. From that night on, things escalated. Sounds followed me home. Knocks on the side of my cabin after midnight, always 3, always stopping before I could reach the door. The smell of wet fur lingering in places it had no right to be. Dreams where I stood at the mouth of the cave, listening to voices rise from the dark, each one wearing the sound of someone I had failed to find. I began avoiding certain trails, then entire sections. The locals noticed. They always do. "You saw it?" an old woman at the general store said one morning, not looking at me as she rang up my coffee. It was not a question. I didn't answer. Silence, again. She nodded to herself. "They don't like being named," she added. "They don't like being seen, but they hate being ignored." That night, the cave called to me. Not with sound, but with pressure, a pull behind my eyes that made it hard to think of anything else. I knew, with a certainty that terrified me, that whatever lived there was not finished, and neither was I. I packed my gear, checked my radio twice, and drove back toward the tree line, knowing with every mile that the forest had already decided how this would end. I parked farther from the cave than I ever had before, at a turnout that overlooked the valley like a scar cut into the land. Dawn had not yet broken, but the sky was thinning, the black giving way to a bruised blue. I told myself I chose that hour for visibility, for safety. The truth was simpler. I did not want to face that place in full darkness. Some part of me still believed light mattered. The forest did not agree. As soon as I stepped out of the truck, the temperature dropped. Not gradually. Instantly. My breath came out in thick clouds, and the metal of the door burned my fingers when I shut it. The pines stood motionless, their needles heavy with frost that had not been there the night before. It felt staged, like the forest had arranged itself for my arrival. I followed the narrow service trail down into the trees, each step crunching louder than it should have. Sound behaved strangely here. Close noises felt distant. Distant noises felt intimate, brushing against my ears. Somewhere to my left, something exhaled. Somewhere behind me, something shifted its weight. I kept my eyes forward, focused on the dark seam in the earth that marked the cave entrance. The smell hit first. Damp stone, yes, but layered beneath it, old blood and wet fur and something mineral like a struck match that never went out. My stomach clenched. I had been inside dozens of caves over the years. None of them had ever smelled like a living thing. The opening yawned wider than I remembered, its edges rimed with ice despite the absence of snow elsewhere. Cold air spilled out in slow pulses, carrying with it a faint, rhythmic sound. Not dripping water, not wind. Breathing. I stood there longer than I should have, arguing with myself in a low, frantic whisper. Every instinct I had screamed to leave, to get back in the truck, to report structural instability and seal the area off. Procedure gave me a dozen clean exits. Pride closed them all. I switched on my headlamp and stepped inside. The light barely penetrated the darkness, swallowed after a few yards as if the cave drank it. The walls were slick, the stone warm beneath my gloves in a way that made my skin crawl. The breathing sound grew clearer with each step, deep and resonant, echoing through the passages in a way that made it impossible to tell direction or distance. The cave floor sloped downward, gently at first, then steeper, until I had to brace myself against the wall to keep from sliding. My radio crackled once, then died completely. I tried not to think about how far below the surface I was. That was when I heard voices. They came from everywhere and nowhere, overlapping, murmuring just below comprehension. Some cried, some pleaded, some spoke calmly as if explaining something important to someone who refused to listen. I recognized a few of them. A hiker I had pulled from a ravine years ago, a teenage boy who vanished near the river and was never found. Their voices were imperfect, slightly distorted, but close enough to dig under my ribs and squeeze. I pressed my hands over my ears. The sound did not diminish. "You shouldn't be here," a voice said clearly, right behind me. I spun, light flaring wildly. The passage was empty. My heart hammered so hard I thought it might drown out everything else. I told myself it was memory, stress, exhaustion. I told myself a lot of things. None of them stopped my legs from shaking. Deeper in, the tunnel widened into a chamber so large my light couldn't find the ceiling. The floor was uneven, scattered with stones and bones, too many to be coincidence, too old to be recent. In the center of the chamber, the temperature rose noticeably, the air thick and damp against my skin. And there, rising slowly from the shadows, was the thing I had seen in the forest. Up close, it was worse. Its height was impossible in the confined space, its back hunched to avoid scraping the unseen ceiling. Pale hair covered its body in uneven patches, revealing gray, scarred skin beneath. Its chest expanded and contracted with that same patient breathing. When it moved, the ground vibrated faintly, a low hum I felt more than heard. It regarded me with an expression I can only describe as curious. I tried to speak. My mouth opened, but no sound came out. My weapon felt absurdly small in my hands. The creature's eyes fixed on my face, then flicked to my badge, then back again, as if cataloging me. When it spoke, it did not use my voice this time. It used many. The words came layered, several tones overlapping, some familiar, some not. "You keep them safe," it said slowly. "You keep us fed." The meaning hit me harder than any physical blow. Images flashed through my mind. Every missing person, every unexplained disappearance, every body never recovered. I thought of the cave, of the way sound lingered here, waiting. I understood then that this place was not just a dwelling. It was a mouth. My fear sharpened into something else. Anger, grief, a sudden, reckless clarity. "No," I said, my voice breaking but audible. "That's not how this ends." The creature tilted its head again, the motion eerily gentle. For a moment I thought it might laugh. Instead, it took a step forward. The ground shook. Stones skittered across the chamber floor. I did the only thing left to me. I ran. I turned and sprinted back the way I came, boots slipping, lungs burning. The voices rose, deafening chorus, no longer pleading, now angry, accusatory. The cave seemed to constrict around me, passages narrowing where they had been wide, the floor pitching steeply downward. Behind me, the breathing grew louder, faster. Something brushed my shoulder, yanking me sideways into the wall. Pain exploded through my arm. I screamed, the sound torn from my throat, and scrambled onward, fueled by pure panic. The exit light appeared ahead, impossibly far, a pale promise in the dark. I burst out into the forest and kept running, branches tearing at my face, roots grabbing at my boots. I did not stop until my lungs felt shredded and my vision tunneled. When I finally collapsed, the forest was silent again, watching. They never found anything in the cave after that. No bones, no signs of habitation, just stone and damp air and echoes that refused to behave. The official explanation blamed erosion, animal activity, misidentification. I accepted my reassignment without argument. I moved away. I stopped wearing the badge. But sometimes at night, I still hear breathing when the wind dies down. And sometimes when the forest goes too quiet, I remember the words it spoke in that dark place. You keep them safe. You keep us fed. And I wonder how many rangers came before me believing the same things I once did. Believing the forest was only listening and not patiently waiting. I do not work as a ranger anymore, but the forest has never accepted my resignation. Years have passed since I left that valley, yet distance has done nothing to dull the memory. Time only sharpened it, the way pain does when it settles into the bones. I moved south. I took a job that kept me indoors, surrounded by walls that did not breathe and floors that did not hum beneath my feet. I told myself I was done with the woods. I told myself survival meant knowing when to walk away. But the forest does not release people cleanly. It leaves splinters. Some nights, when the air grows too still, I wake with the same pressure behind my eyes, the pull I felt standing at the mouth of that cave. In those moments, I am no longer in my bed. I am back among the pines, my breath fogging, listening to a silence that feels deliberate. I smell wet fur where none should be. I hear footsteps that stop when I stop thinking about them. I tried to talk about it once, not the details, never the details, but the weight of it. The way fear had rewired me, the way certainty had cracked and never quite fit back together. The therapist listened patiently, nodded, offered explanations rooted in trauma and exposure and moral injury. All of them were reasonable. None of them accounted for the fact that sometimes my phone rings at night with no caller ID, and when I answer, I hear breathing on the other end. Deep, familiar, patient. I stopped answering unknown numbers. The locals, I later learned, continued whispering. Hikers still vanished. Hunters still reported sounds that followed them but never closed the distance. A younger ranger took my place in that district. Strong, confident, the kind of man I used to be. When his name appeared in an article months later, missing during a routine patrol near an unstable cave system, I closed the browser and sat in the dark for a long time. Guilt is a strange thing. It doesn't shout. It waits. It asks quiet questions when you are least prepared to answer them. Had I done enough? Had I sealed the place, warned enough people, spoken louder instead of choosing silence? Or had the forest simply claimed what it was owed, regardless of human effort? I still believe rules matter. I still believe training saves lives. But I no longer believe reason is enough. There are places where logic thins, where explanation frays, where something older presses up from beneath the surface and reminds you how small your understanding really is. The cave was never just a cave. It was a boundary, a reminder that some things do not exist to be conquered or cataloged. They exist to endure, to feed, to wait. I think often about the voices I heard down there. The way they layered over each other, human and not, grief and hunger tangled together. I don't know if those voices were echoes, memories, or something worse. I only know they knew me. They knew my name, my role, my history of believing I was the one keeping order at the edge of chaos. That belief was my greatest weakness. The forest does not need protectors. It needs witnesses, people willing to listen without assuming they are in control. People who understand that awe and terror are not opposites, but neighbors. If you walk among the pines long enough, you will feel it. That subtle pressure, the sense of being measured. The woods do not rush their judgments, they observe. They learn your patterns. They wait until you are certain you are alone. When that certainty settles in, when the birds fall silent and the wind forgets its own name, remember this: silence is not emptiness, it is attention. If you hear knocking where no door stands, do not answer. If you hear your name spoken by something you cannot see, do not respond. If the ground beneath your feet feels warm when it should be cold, turn back. And if you ever find yourself standing at the mouth of a cave that smells faintly of breath and memory, understand that some thresholds are not meant to be crossed, no matter how strong your reasons feel. I learned that too late. The forest is still there. It always will be. And sometimes when the night grows quiet enough, I am certain it remembers me, not with anger, not with malice, but with the calm patience of something that knows our paths will cross again. Because the spirits of the pines do not forget. They only whisper. The night the forest decided to speak back to me, it did not raise its voice. It simply took away the silence I depended on to feel safe. I had been a ranger long enough to believe that silence was a tool, not a threat. Silence meant order. It meant the systems I trusted, the animals, the weather, the old trails worn down by decades of boots, were behaving as expected. That night, silence vanished without warning, as if the trees themselves had inhaled and forgotten how to exhale. My name doesn't matter as much as the years I've given to the woods. I was 38 then, born in a logging town that no longer appears on most maps, raised by men who believed the forest was something you worked with, not something you conquered. I wore the uniform because it felt like a continuation of that belief, a promise that I would stand between the land and the people who underestimated it. I worked in a northern stretch of pine forest that locals avoided after dark, a place thick with glacial rock, sinkholes, and caves that never made it into the tourist brochures. The kind of forest that smells like wet iron after rain and holds on to cold long after winter should have released it. The locals had their own names for the things that happened out there. They spoke, They spoke softly when they talked about missing hunters, about sounds that didn't echo correctly, about footprints that ended where nothing else should have begun. They would ask me questions they already knew the answers to, just to see if I'd lie. I always told them what policy required: wildlife patterns, disorientation, hypothermia. I believed it myself until the forest taught me the cost of certainty. That night started with a routine call. A hiker overdue, last seen near an old fire road that cut close to a cave system I'd been warning people away from for years. I parked my truck just past the tree line and stepped out into air so cold it scraped my lungs raw. The radio crackled once, then went dead. I told myself it was the terrain. I told myself a lot of things back then. As I walked, my headlamp caught the trunks of the pines in pieces, like ribs emerging from darkness. The smell shifted the deeper I went. Less sap, more damp stone. My boots pressed into soil that felt recently disturbed, though no tracks made sense. The forest wasn't quiet anymore. It was wrong. The wind moved without rhythm. Branches creaked as if under weight they shouldn't have been bearing. I remember laughing under my breath, the way people do when they feel fear pressing too close to their chest. I'd heard the stories, the tall shapes, the thing that walked upright but didn't walk like a man. I'd dismissed them all, even after I'd seen claw marks too high for any known animal, even after I'd found deer remains arranged in ways that felt intentional. I told myself the brain invents patterns when it's tired. The cave entrance appeared sooner than I expected, a black mouth in the side of a limestone rise, breathing out air colder than the night around it. My light skimmed over the ground, catching on something pale. Fabric. A torn piece of a jacket snagged on stone. I knelt, fingers numb as I lifted it, and felt a tremor run through me that had nothing to do with the cold. That was when I heard it. not a roar, not a howl, a sound like breath being pulled through a chest too large for its own lungs. Slow, deliberate, close enough that my skin prickled as if something unseen had leaned in. I stood too fast, the world spinning. My training told me to call out, to make myself known. My instincts, those quiet, buried things I'd learned to ignore, screamed at me to stay still. The sound came again, followed by the scrape of stone against stone deeper inside the cave. Something moved with weight, with confidence, not lost, not afraid. I told myself it was a bear. I told myself bears breathe, bears move, but bears don't pause, listening back. My light shook as I aimed it toward the cave's interior. The beam cut across rock walls slick with moisture, then caught on a shape that did not belong to the cave. Hair, matted and dark, hung in uneven lengths. A shoulder, broad and sloped wrong, shifted just out of full view. I didn't see a face. I didn't need to. The fear didn't arrive all at once. It seeped in, slow and poisonous, undermining every explanation I'd ever trusted. My legs locked. My mouth went dry. The radio at my shoulder hissed with sudden static, loud enough to make me flinch. The sound in the cave stopped. For a moment, everything held its breath. Then something stepped forward. The ground vibrated under my boots. Dust fell from the cave ceiling. The shape filled the entrance without fully revealing itself, as if it understood the power of suggestion. I remember thinking, absurdly, that it was letting me imagine the worst, letting my own mind finish the picture. Panic broke through my paralysis like glass shattering. I backed away, nearly falling, my heel catching on a root. The forest around me seemed to close in, branches snagging at my jacket as if trying to hold me there. Behind me, the breath returned, louder now, accompanied by a low sound that resonated in my chest more than my ears. I ran. I don't remember the path back. I remember the sensation of being followed without hearing pursuit. I remember the sudden awareness of my own heartbeat, too loud, too fast. I remember the cave disappearing behind me, swallowed by trees that looked no different than they ever had. I reached my truck shaking, hands slipping on the door handle. When I finally got inside and locked the doors, I sat there in the dark, head pressed against the steering wheel, waiting for the sound of something large moving through brush. Nothing came. By the time dawn crept in, pale and indifferent, I had convinced myself I'd imagined it. Exhaustion, stress, a trick of light and fear. I filed my report carefully, choosing my words with precision. No mention of shapes, no mention of breath. The hiker was never found, not officially, but the forest remembered. In the weeks that followed, the unease didn't fade. It settled. I started noticing things I'd overlooked before. Trails that subtly changed, trees scarred at heights that made no sense. The cave appearing in my dreams, closer each time, its mouth widening as if learning my name. I told myself I was still in control, that I had learned something important, that knowledge would keep me safe. I was wrong. After that night, I stopped trusting the forest the way I once had, but I didn't stop working it. That was the lie I told myself, that caution was the same thing as respect, and respect would be enough. I doubled my patrols. I memorized weather patterns with obsessive care. I stopped camping overnight unless regulations required it. I told myself these were professional adjustments, not fear-driven rituals. The locals noticed the change anyway. They always do. They began stopping me more often at the ranger station, lingering with questions that circled around what they really wanted to ask. An older man who ran a bait shop downstate told me he'd heard something moving through the pines above his cabin, something that made the ground hum like a distant generator. A woman who'd lived her whole life on the edge of the forest asked me if I'd ever seen tracks that didn't lead anywhere. When I didn't answer right away, she nodded like that was answer enough. I still told myself there was a rational explanation for everything. The human mind demands coherence. Without it, you start to unravel. I'd seen that happen to rangers who stayed too long in one place, who let the wilderness blur their edges. I believed distance, emotional distance, was the solution. Then the calls started coming in closer together. A group of college kids vanished for half a day near the old quarry trails. They stumbled out just before nightfall, shaken, insisting they'd been walking in circles even though the sun hadn't moved the way it should have. A hunter swore something followed him for 3 miles without ever making a sound, close enough that he could smell it, wet fur and cold earth. I logged the incidents, used neutral language, avoided patterns. Avoidance became a skill. The cave, though, refused to be avoided. It showed up again during a winter search and rescue operation, its entrance partially iced over, exhaling that same unnatural cold. I hadn't been assigned to that sector, but I felt pulled toward it anyway, like a bruise you keep pressing just to remind yourself it's real. Inside, the air felt heavier, pressing against my sinuses. The walls were scratched in long vertical lines that caught my light like polished bone. I didn't go far in. I told myself it wasn't necessary. That's what denial sounds like when it puts on a uniform. What changed everything wasn't the cave itself. It was the footprints. They appeared after a late snowfall, crisp and unmistakable. Too wide, too deep. Each step placed with an economy of motion that suggested intelligence, not instinct. They came out of the tree line, crossed a frozen creek without breaking through the ice, and stopped dead in the middle of an open clearing. No turn, no retreat, just an ending. I stood there for a long time, breath fogging in the cold, trying to force logic into the shape of what I was seeing. Wind should have filled them in. Snow should have softened the edges. Instead, they looked freshly pressed, like the thing that made them had simply stopped being there. That night, I dreamed of standing in the clearing alone. In the dream, the forest leaned inward, every tree angled just slightly toward me. I could hear breathing behind my ear, warm and patient. When I turned, there was nothing, just the sense of being measured. I woke up with my heart racing and the smell of damp stone in my nose. The next incident involved a fellow ranger. He was younger than me, still carried that untested confidence that comes from believing procedures will save you. He went missing during a solo patrol near the ridge above the cave system. When we found him hours later, he was alive, but changed. He couldn't explain where he'd been. His radio was intact, his gear undamaged, but his eyes wouldn't settle on anything for long. He told me quietly that he'd heard something calling his name from underground. I wanted to dismiss it. I wanted to tell him stress does that to people, that the forest plays tricks when you're tired. But there was a tremor in his hands I recognized too well. It was the same one I'd had gripping my steering wheel months earlier. After that, I started doing something I'd never done before. I listened, not just with my ears, but with the part of me that had learned to ignore discomfort. I paid attention to when birds stopped singing without reason, to when the wind shifted against its own logic, to the way the pines sometimes creaked in unison, as if responding to a pressure change I couldn't feel. One night, during an overnight watch I couldn't avoid, the forest made its intention clear. I was camped on a ridge overlooking the valley, my fire kept deliberately small. The stars were sharp and numerous, the kind of sky that usually settles the mind. Instead, I felt exposed, like the dark was studying me the way I'd once studied maps. The sound started just after midnight. Heavy footsteps, spaced too evenly, moving through the trees below. Not crashing, not careless, deliberate. Each step placed with awareness. I killed my light and held my breath, the fire dimming to embers. The steps stopped. A shape moved at the edge of my vision, tall enough that it blocked stars as it passed between trunks. I could smell it again, that same mix of wet fur and mineral cold. The realization hit me then, sharp and undeniable. It wasn't stalking prey. It was checking boundaries. My chest tightened as the thing circled the ridge, never fully revealing itself, never needing to. I felt small in a way I hadn't since childhood, when adults still held all the answers. Every rule I'd built my sense of safety on felt thin and negotiable. At one point, a rock shifted near my camp, nudged just enough to roll. Not thrown, tested. I stayed perfectly still until dawn burned the shadows away. When the sun finally rose, the forest looked ordinary again. That was the cruelest part. Nothing marked, nothing broken, just the lingering sense that something had learned me, the way you learn terrain. I didn't file a report that morning. I couldn't find words that wouldn't sound like surrender. What I didn't know yet was that the forest wasn't done teaching me, and the lesson it was building toward would cost me the last piece of certainty I had left. After that night on the ridge, something fundamental shifted inside me. Fear stopped being an occasional visitor and became a low, constant pressure. Like elevation sickness, you pretend isn't there because acknowledging it would mean turning back. I told myself I was still doing my job, still protecting people from the forest's known dangers. But the truth was harder to admit. I had started protecting the forest from people. I rerouted trails under the guise of erosion control. I closed off sections near the cave system, citing unstable rock. I stood firm against complaints, even when they came from supervisors who wanted the area opened up for spring tourism. Every decision felt justified, but beneath the paperwork was a quieter motive. I didn't want anyone else wandering into the spaces where reason thinned out. The cave began to feel less like a location and more like an idea. A presence. I could be miles away and still feel its pull, like gravity working through memory instead of mass. I caught myself studying maps late at night, tracing the underground passages with my finger, imagining how far they might extend beyond what we'd charted. Old miners' notes mentioned tunnels that changed direction when revisited. I'd laughed at that once. I didn't laugh anymore. The next disappearance wasn't sudden. It unfolded slowly, the way rot spreads inside a tree before the bark ever splits. An experienced backcountry guide failed to check in after a routine solo route. He knew the forest as well as anyone I'd ever met. He respected it. That should have counted for something. We found his camp intact. Fire ring cold, gear neatly packed, boots lined up just outside his tent as if he'd stepped out briefly and expected to return. What we didn't find were tracks. No sign of struggle. No drag marks. Just a subtle disturbance in the pine needles leading toward a rock outcrop I recognized immediately. The entrance to one of the lesser-known cave mouths, partially collapsed and officially sealed. I stood there longer than protocol allowed, staring at the darkness beyond the stones. My team waited behind me, their unease radiating outward. I wanted to tell them to turn back. I wanted to seal the area and walk away. Instead, I stepped forward. Inside, the air was wrong. Still, but not stale, like it was being held deliberately. Our lights cut narrow tunnels through the dark, illuminating walls that seemed to absorb brightness rather than reflect it. The cave narrowed quickly, forcing us to move single file. Every sound felt amplified, then strangely muted, as if the space decided what it wanted to let us hear. We found the guide's radio first, placed carefully on a rock ledge. It wasn't damaged, it wasn't dropped, it was set down. Farther in, we found marks along the wall, handprints smeared and uneven as though someone had been pulled sideways. The rock beneath them was scratched deep, grooves too wide and irregular to be fingernails alone. That was when the sound started. A low vibration, felt more than heard, rolling through the stone beneath our boots. One of the rangers whispered my name, panic barely contained. I raised a hand, though my own heart was hammering hard enough to hurt. The vibration grew stronger, resolving into something like distant footsteps echoing through a vast chamber beyond our light's reach. The cave seemed to widen ahead of us, the darkness thickening instead of receding. I knew with a certainty that bypassed thought that we were being approached. I ordered the team to retreat. No arguments. No delays. We backed out slowly, lights trained forward, every instinct screaming at us to turn and run. The vibration followed, stopping when we did, advancing when we moved. It wasn't chasing us, it was escorting us. We broke into open air, shaking and silent. No one spoke until we were back at the trucks. Later, the official report would mention structural instability, equipment failure, inconclusive findings. The guide was listed as presumed lost. None of us ever returned to that cave. After that, sleep became unreliable. When I did manage it, my dreams were filled with depth, falling without motion, moving through spaces too large to comprehend. I'd wake with the sensation of having been watched, of something retreating just as my eyes opened. The forest began to feel crowded, even when I was alone. The final encounter came not during a crisis, but during a moment of quiet. I let my guard down. Early autumn, fog hanging low between the trees. I was walking a closed trail at dawn, checking boundary markers. The world was muted, colors washed thin, sound dampened. I sensed it before I saw anything. The same pressure I'd felt on the ridge, magnified. The forest ahead seemed to bend inward, trunks curving subtly, perspective skewed. My steps slowed without conscious decision. Then I saw the figure. It stood partially obscured by mist, tall enough that its head brushed the lower branches. Broad shoulders sloped forward, covered in dark, tangled hair that glistened with moisture. It wasn't moving, wasn't threatening. It was simply there, occupying space like a fact the world had been waiting to reveal. My mind scrambled for labels. Yeti, Bigfoot, folklore. But none of them fit the weight of the presence in front of me. This wasn't an animal. It wasn't a monster. It was old. Its face remained in shadow, but I felt its attention settle on me with a force that made my knees weaken. Images flashed through my head, caves extending endlessly, bones layered beneath stone, the slow patience of something that had outlasted generations of certainty. I realized then that all my fear had been misplaced. It wasn't the forest that was fragile. It was us. The figure took one step forward, the ground compressed beneath it, pine needles sinking deep. I smelled damp earth, cold stone, something metallic and ancient. My chest tightened, breath coming shallow. I didn't run. I stood there, shaking, and understood the final lesson the forest had been trying to teach me all along. Control was an illusion. Protection was conditional. The woods didn't need guardians. It needed witnesses who knew when to step back. The figure turned away, mist swallowing its shape as it moved deeper into the trees. The pressure lifted, leaving me hollow and exhausted. I stayed there until the fog burned off and sunlight filtered through the pines, ordinary and harmless again. I resigned my post 3 months later. People ask why I left. Burnout, stress, budget cuts. I let them believe it. Sometimes late at night, I still hear the forest breathing in my dreams. I still smell damp stone when the air turns cold. I don't camp anymore. I don't wander off trail. But I do tell people this when they're willing to listen. The woods are not empty. They never were. And if you walk into them believing you understand everything that watches you from the dark, the forest will eventually correct you. I thought leaving would quiet it. I believed distance would do what reason could not. Dull the edge, soften the memory, let the forest recede into something I could file away as a chapter that had simply ended. That belief lasted exactly 1 season. When winter came, it brought silence back to my life, but not the kind I remembered. Snow muffled the world outside my small house on the edge of town, turning nights into blank pages. That was when the forest returned, not as sound, not as shape, but as presence. I would wake before dawn with the certainty that something was standing just beyond the tree line, not threatening, not advancing, simply existing with the same patience I had felt in the cave and on the ridge. Watching, not me specifically, but the place I now occupied, as if confirming I had learned my lesson and stayed where I belonged. I stopped talking about my years as a ranger. When people asked, I gave them the clean version. Good work, hard days, beautiful country. I avoided specifics, avoided names of trails, avoided caves altogether. But sometimes, usually when the nights stretched too long, I thought about the people who never came back. The hiker, the guide, the ones whose stories ended mid-sentence. I wondered if they had reached the same understanding I had, or if they'd resisted it right up until the dark closed in. What haunted me most wasn't the fear anymore. Fear fades. It burns hot, then cools into memory. What remained was humility, heavy and permanent. I had spent years believing the forest was a system that could be managed, patrolled, protected. I'd believed knowledge was a shield. But the woods don't operate on our terms. They hold their own timelines, their own hierarchies of importance. We are visitor, temporary, loud, fragile. Sometimes I drive past the old boundary roads that are stopping just short of where pavement gives way to dirt. The trees look the same to anyone else. Tall, straight, familiar. But I can see the subtle differences now. The way certain clearings never quite feel empty. The way shadows pool where they shouldn't. I don't cross those lines anymore. Respect, I've learned, is knowing when not to enter. The locals still whisper. New stories replace the old ones. A strange sound near the pines, a cave that seems deeper than it should be. A shape seen at dawn, gone by the time anyone else looks. People ask if I think it's real. I tell them the truth, the only truth that matters. The forest doesn't care what you believe. It doesn't need your fear. It doesn't need your faith. It only asks for awareness, and even that is optional. Step too far without it, and you may never realize what you've walked into until it's already behind you, breathing softly, waiting for you to understand. I still dream of the cave sometimes, not as a place of terror, but as a symbol. A reminder that beneath every surface we think we've mapped, there are depths we haven't earned the right to explore. Secrets don't stay buried because they're dangerous. They stay buried because they're older than our need to explain them. If there's a legacy I carry from those years, it isn't bravery or authority. It's restraint. The wisdom to listen when silence changes. The courage to turn back when every part of you wants answers instead of survival. So if you walk the forests of this country, if you camp beneath the pines or hike beyond the last signpost, remember this: not every trail is meant to be followed to its end. Some paths exist only to remind us that we are small and that the world we step into at the edge of the firelight has rules we will never fully know. And if one night the forest seems to breathe back at you, don't wait for proof. Leave. I still hear the radio crackle at night, even when there's no battery in the unit and no towers within 50 miles that could possibly reach me. That's how I know this isn't over. I've been a forest ranger for 19 years. Federal service, search and rescue, backcountry law enforcement. I chose this job because I believed in order, maps, rules, trail markers, permits, logic. I believed the wilderness was dangerous, yes, but honest. If you respected it, it respected you back. That belief kept me alive longer than most. It also blinded me. The incident I'm about to describe began 3 winters ago, though that isn't when the damage started. The damage started long before that, with a missing person report I signed off too quickly and a search grid I approved that left a square mile untouched. A square mile I still see when I close my eyes. I don't record confessions. Rangers aren't supposed to. Reports are factual, unemotional, clean, but this isn't a report. This is residue. This is what's left after the paperwork stops making sense. The call came in just after dawn. A hiker hadn't returned to a trailhead that officially didn't exist anymore, decommissioned 20 years prior. The kind of trail only locals remembered, and even then, only vaguely. The dispatcher's voice sounded wrong, too calm, too rehearsed. She gave me coordinates that didn't align with any current map overlay. I remember saying that. These coordinates don't line up with anything, I told her. There was a pause, long enough that I checked my signal strength. They do on ours, she replied. That should have been my first warning. The access road was unplowed despite recent ranger logs claiming maintenance. My truck crawled through snow that smelled faintly metallic like cold pennies. No wind. No birds. The forest stood locked in a posture of attention, trees angled inward, branches overlapping like ribs. Sound didn't carry correctly. The crunch of my boots felt muted, swallowed inches from my feet. I radioed in my arrival. Static answered back, then a breath. Not a voice, a breath. I stood there, one gloved hand on the radio, waiting for it to resolve into interference. It didn't. It exhaled again, slow and deliberate, friend, as if whatever was on the other end was pacing its breathing to mine. I told myself it was atmospheric distortion, temperature inversion, old equipment. That's what we do. We assign causes until the fear fits inside language. The trailhead sign was there when I reached it. Fresh wood, no rot. The lettering burned dark into the plank read only one word: return. I checked our archives later, no record of that sign, no authorization, no materials request. It simply existed. The trail itself descended too steeply for the topography. Switchbacks missing. The ground vibrated faintly under my boots, not like an earthquake, more like something massive shifting its weight far below. Every few minutes, I felt a cold pressure against my chest, as if the air were briefly remembering a different gravity. I found the first footprint an hour in, barefoot, perfectly formed, toes splayed too wide, heel too narrow. The print sank deeper than it should have in frozen soil, as though the ground had softened specifically to receive it. Nearby were boot prints, standard hiking tread, circling the bare print in tight, frantic loops. I recognized the pattern, panic walking, someone trying to convince themselves they weren't lost. I called it in. This time, the radio responded with my own voice. "Stay where you are," it said. "Help is coming." Except I hadn't said that. Not yet. The smell hit next. Burnt hair and wet fur, layered beneath the clean scent of snow. It drifted from downhill, growing stronger the farther I went, until it coated the back of my throat. My eyes watered. My breath fogged, then didn't. For several seconds, I exhaled and saw nothing. The temperature rose sharply. Snow melted in irregular patches, revealing earth veined with black stone that pulsed faintly like capillaries. I knelt to examine one and felt something brush my ankle. Light, deliberate. I froze, expecting to see an animal. There was nothing there. Behind me, the forest sighed. Trees shifted without wind, trunks creaking as if joints were being reset. When I turned, silhouettes stood between the pines, human-shaped, motionless. I stared at one for a full minute, watching its edges ripple slightly, like heat distortion. When I blinked, it was closer. I fired a flare. The red light cut through the trees, illuminating faces where there shouldn't have been any. Blank plains where eyes should sit, skin textured like bark and scar tissue. The flare died too quickly, snuffed out midair, leaving after images burned into my vision. I ran. The trail ended at a rock face that wasn't on any survey. Smooth, vertical, seamless, except for a narrow opening half hidden by frost and dead vines. Cold poured from it in waves. My teeth began to chatter uncontrollably, even as sweat soaked my base layer. From inside the opening, something spoke. It used my name, not shouted, not whispered, spoken the way a parent speaks to a sleeping child, careful not to wake them. I backed away, heart hammering, every instinct screaming retreat. But beneath that was another pull, familiar, insistent. The same pull I'd felt years earlier, standing at the edge of the search grid I'd approved, the square mile we never searched. I realized then that this wasn't a rescue mission. It was a retrieval, and whatever was down there knew exactly who to call. I stepped closer to the opening, the radio at my hip crackling softly, breathing in time with me, and for the first time since taking this job, I understood something with absolute clarity. The forest had been listening all along. I crossed the threshold because turning back felt worse. That's the part I don't put in reports. We like to pretend every step forward is justified by protocol or duty. The truth is simpler and more humiliating. Sometimes the dark feels familiar, and familiarity is easier than admitting you're afraid. The opening narrowed after a few yards, stone pressing close enough that my pack scraped on both sides. Ice glazed the walls in thin sheets, but beneath it the rock was warm. Not heat, life. A dull, organic warmth that seeped through my gloves when I touched it. The smell intensified. Burnt hair layered over iron, rot masked by something antiseptic, like a hospital corridor scrubbed too many times. My headlamp flickered. When it stabilized, the beam revealed scratches along the walls. Not tool marks. Fingers. Too many of them. Overlapping, frantic, gouged deep enough to leave shavings curled on the ground like dead leaves. I told myself miners could have done it. Old tunnels, panic, carbon monoxide, hallucinations. I kept a running list of explanations because stopping meant listening to the silence, and the silence was wrong. It wasn't empty. It was attentive. The cave breathed with me, pressure rising and falling in my ears. The radio crackled again. "Grid C7," my voice said. "You missed it last time." I shut the radio off and kept walking. The passage opened into a chamber so large my light couldn't find the ceiling. The floor dipped into shallow water, perfectly still, reflecting my beam back at me. In the reflection, I was standing slightly to the left of where I knew I was. My reflection lifted its arm a fraction of a second too late. I didn't look away. I watched it smile. Behind the reflection, shapes stood submerged just beneath the surface. Faces pressed up from below, mouths open as if screaming into the water. No bubbles rose. They didn't move. They waited. A sound echoed from deeper in the chamber. Footsteps, bare skin on stone. Slow. Confident. I raised my weapon and shouted, identifying myself. The words bounced back wrong, stretched and slurred as though the cave were chewing on them before returning them. Something answered, not in words but in cadence. It matched the rhythm of my speech, the rise and fall of authority without meaning attached. Mocking me. I retreated along the edge of the water and nearly tripped over a pack half buried in silt. Standard issue hiking pack. Torn open. Inside were laminated maps marked with Ranger grid overlays. My grids. Notes in the margins, written in my handwriting. Except I had never written them. Coordinates circled in red, warnings scrawled hard enough to tear the paper. One sentence repeated over and over. "Ite knows your voice." A memory surfaced then, unwanted. The missing person from years ago. The one we never found. A teenage boy, local, wandered off trail chasing a sound he thought was his father calling. The father had been dead for 6 months. I'd written probable exposure and closed the case. The footsteps grew louder. I swung my light toward the sound and caught a glimpse of movement, something tall and wrong-limbed slipping behind a rock outcropping. It stood upright but bent too easily, puff joints folding inward like it had been assembled without instructions. Its skin reflected light dully like wet clay. When it leaned out again, it wore my face. Not a copy, a memory, younger, less tired. The scar on my chin from academy training was gone. It spoke without moving its mouth. "You left them," it said, my voice steady and calm. "You always leave." I fired. The report was deafening in the enclosed space. The figure didn't flinch. The bullet struck stone inches from its head, ricocheted, and vanished into the dark. The thing tilted its head, studying me with my own eyes, then stepped backward and dissolved into shadow. The chamber shuddered. Ripples spread across the water as the submerged faces sank out of sight. The temperature dropped violently. Frost bloomed across my visor, and my breath came out in ragged bursts. Something brushed my calf again, firmer this time. Fingers. I ran. The tunnel sloped downward, twisting tighter with every turn. The walls pulsed now, faint vibrations thrumming through my bones. The sound of breathing multiplied, overlapping, until it was impossible to tell which was mine. Whispers threaded through it, dozens of them, all using my voice, all saying different things. Turn back. Keep going. You're almost home. I burst into another chamber, smaller, more contained. Man-made. Concrete walls reinforced with rusted steel ribs. Just a bunker. The kind built during eras when fear justified everything. The door hung open, its hinges warped outward as if something had forced its way in from below. Inside, the air was stale and warm. Heat lamps hummed faintly, impossibly still, drawing power. Desks lined the walls, covered in dustless papers. Monitors glowed with static. On one screen, a live feed showed me standing in the cave, panting, eyes wild. I approached the screen slowly. The image lagged, then caught up. Behind me in the feed, something stood just out of the headlamp's reach. I spun around. Nothing. Back on the screen, it stepped closer. Tall, featureless. Its surface rippled as if struggling to maintain a shape. When it leaned down, it pressed its head against my shoulder in the video, resting there intimately, possessively. I felt the weight of it then. Invisible. Crushing. Cold pressure on my chest, forcing the air from my lungs. I collapsed to my knees, gasping, clawing at empty space. The whispers crescendoed, overlapping into a single command. Remember. Images flooded my mind. Every search called off too soon. Every report softened to avoid paperwork. Every disappearance filed under unknown. Faces blurred together, mouths open in the same silent scream I'd seen beneath the water. The pressure lifted abruptly. I slumped forward, retching. When I looked up, the monitors were dark. The bunker lights flickered, then died one by one, plunging me into absolute black. In the darkness, something leaned close to my ear. It breathed. And in that breath, I understood the truth I'd been circling since the first call came in. This place doesn't kill you. It keeps you. I don't know how long I stayed on the bunker floor after the lights went out. Time didn't behave normally underground. Seconds stretched until they felt thick, gelatinous, then collapsed into nothing. My watch had stopped. Condensation fogged the inside of my visor even though I wasn't breathing hard anymore. That should have terrified me more than it did. Silence returned, but not the empty kind. This silence had structure. It had edges. I could feel it pressing against my thoughts, shaping them, steering them away from panic and towards something quieter, more dangerous. Acceptance. I forced myself to stand. My legs trembled, not from exhaustion but from resistance. Like part of me didn't want to leave the floor. Like staying down was safer. The bunker corridor extended deeper than the exterior structure suggested. Concrete walls sweat a viscous moisture that smelled faintly of copper and mold. Old military signage clung to the walls, stenciled warnings in fading black paint. Some were familiar, authorized personnel only, restricted access, but others made no sense. Voice compliant zone, do not respond to unverified calls. My stomach tightened. That phrasing wasn't standard, it wasn't even bureaucratic. It sounded reactive, like a rule written after too many people made the same mistake. The floor sloped downward. With every step, the temperature climbed. Heat waves shimmered in the beam of my headlamp, warping the corridor ahead so it looked like it was breathing. I heard movement behind the walls, slow shifting, like something enormous rolling over in its sleep. I reached a junction where the corridor split in 3 directions. Each path was marked with a placard. Observation Retention Interface. I laughed. I couldn't help it. A short broken sound that echoed too long. Interface, I muttered. Of course. The radio at my hip clicked on by itself. Correct, my voice said gently. I ripped the battery out and threw it down the corridor. It clattered, bounced, then stopped abruptly. Too abruptly. No final echo. Like it had been caught. I chose observation. The room beyond was circular, lined with thick reinforced glass panels. On the other side of the glass was darkness, absolute, light-swallowing black that refused to reflect my beam. I stepped closer and saw my reflection faintly overlaying the void. Except my reflection was older, deeper lines, eyes hollowed out, a mouth that sagged with exhaustion I hadn't earned yet. It raised its hand. I didn't. The glass between us spider-webbed with fine cracks, not from impact but from pressure. From the other side. I staggered back as the cracks spread, then stopped. The glass held. Whatever was pressing against it withdrew slowly, reluctantly. A console sat in the center of the room, surprisingly clean. Its screen flickered to life as I approached. Text scrolled across it, assembling itself letter by letter. Subject has returned, prior exposure confirmed, memory integration in progress. My mouth went dry. Return implied a first visit. I searched my memory desperately, clawing through years of routine patrols and uneventful seasons. Nothing like this surfaced. But beneath that certainty was a hollowness, a gap I'd never questioned because I didn't know it was there. The screen changed. It showed a map, not of the forest above, but beneath it. A sprawling network of tunnels and chambers, veins branching out in impossible geometries. And at the center of it all, pulsing faintly, was a shape that wasn't labeled. The map zoomed out, layers peeling back. The underground network extended far beyond park boundaries, beyond state lines, webbing across the continent like a second, hidden country. "This isn't possible," I whispered. The console responded with a soft tone. "Possibility is irrelevant. Function is persistent." The whispers returned, softer now, threaded with something like relief. I realized with a sick lurch that they weren't coming from the walls. They were coming from me. Thoughts I didn't remember thinking slid into place, finishing themselves. Rationalizations polished smooth by repetition. It needs witnesses. It needs voices. It can't come up here unless invited. I slammed my fist against my helmet. hard enough to make stars burst behind my eyes. Pain grounded me for a moment. I backed out of the observation room and staggered into the corridor again, choosing at random. The signs blurred together as I passed them. The bunker felt larger now, corridors rearranging themselves subtly when I wasn't looking. Doors I was sure hadn't been there before loomed open as beckoning. I heard footsteps ahead. Human. Booted. "Ranger?" a voice called. Not mine. Hope flared so violently it hurt. I ran toward it and nearly collided with a woman in standard field gear. Patches, radio, sidearm. Her face was pale, eyes rimmed red with exhaustion. She looked as relieved to see me as I was to see her. "Thank God," she said. "I thought I was the only one left." Her name patch read Carter. I searched my memory. Nothing. "Where did you come from?" I asked. She hesitated, just a fraction too long. "Search and rescue," she said. "Called in after you." After me. I nodded slowly, not trusting my voice. Behind her, down the corridor, shadows shifted in ways that didn't align with her movements. "We need to leave," I said. "Now." She smiled sadly. "I tried," she replied. "It doesn't work like that." The lights overhead flickered, then steadied. The air vibrated with a low hum that settled into my bones. From somewhere deep below, something massive shifted, and the bunker seemed to lean toward us, eager. Carter stepped closer, lowering her voice. "It listens for the ones who feel guilty," she said. "The ones who stay awake at night replaying what they missed." Her eyes shimmered, reflecting shapes that weren't there. "It already knows you," she continued. "You've been here longer than you think." The hum deepened. The floor vibrated, and in that vibration, buried beneath layers of denial and fear, a memory finally broke through. A prior descent, a choice, a bargain made in the dark. My knees buckled as the truth pressed in, heavy and unavoidable. I hadn't come here to rescue anyone. I had come back to finish what I started. The memory didn't arrive all at once. It seeped in through the cracks Carter's words had opened, filling the hollow spaces I'd spent years pretending were solid. I had been here before. Not recently. Not last winter. Years ago, early in my career when I still believed procedure could outrun fear. There had been another missing persons case back then. Multiple, actually. A cluster spread across jurisdictions, quietly handed off, softened, buried under interagency language. I'd been selected because I was new, meticulous, unscarred enough to listen without flinching. They didn't call it a briefing. They called it a walk. I remembered the man who led it. No insignia, no name. He spoke like someone used to being obeyed, not respected. He told me the land predated ownership, predated borders, that something beneath it had learned us the way we learn terrain, by watching who survives. "You can't kill it," he'd said, standing at the mouth of this same opening. "You can only limit how it feeds. It fed on attention, on voices, on those who responded when called. Some people were more susceptible, people who carried guilt, people who listened too closely, rangers, searchers, parents, me. The bargain had been simple or framed that way. Containment through familiarity, observation through exposure, reduction through sacrifice. We would redirect disappearances, close cases early, leave certain areas unmapped, teach ourselves not to answer when the forest spoke in familiar tones, and when necessary, when activity spiked, we would send someone down, someone it already knew, a caretaker. I remembered standing in the observation room, younger, hands steady, heart racing but intact. I remembered the glass cracking then, too, remembered the pressure, the voice wearing my own cadence. "You will come back," it had told me, not as a threat, as a statement of process. I'd agreed, not because I was brave, because I was afraid of what would happen if I said no. The memory finished settling, and with it came the weight of everything I'd helped bury. Carter watched my face as understanding dawned, her expression unreadable. "You remember now," she said. I nodded. "What happens to me?" I asked. She didn't answer right away. The hum beneath our feet deepened, vibrating through my teeth, my skull. The bunker lights dimmed, then steadied, as if adjusting to a preferred setting. "Retention," she said finally. "Some of us stay longer, some of us dissolve faster." Her outline flickered for a moment, edges blurring like heat distortion. I realized then that I couldn't remember seeing her arrive. No echo of footsteps. No radio chatter. Just her voice, emerging when I needed to hear it. "You're not real," I said. "I was," she replied, "once." The corridor behind her darkened, stretching into a depth that hurt to look at. From it came the sound of movement, slow, deliberate, vast, the thing beneath the forest shifting toward wakefulness. "I won't do it again," I said. The words sounded small, unconvincing. Carter stepped aside, revealing the corridor-marked interface. The air pouring from it was warm and damp, carrying the layered stench of decay and antiseptic I now recognized as its breath. "You don't get to decide that," she said gently. "You already did." The pressure returned. Invisible weight pressing me forward, guiding rather than forcing. I walked because resisting felt like drowning. The interface chamber was not what I expected. No machinery, no cables, no altar. Just a widening cavern where the stone had been worn smooth by contact. The walls curved inward like a ribcage. At the center was a depression in the ground, pulsing faintly, as if the earth itself had a heartbeat. The whispers rose, no longer fragmented, unified. It didn't speak in words anymore. It didn't need to. Images spilled into me. Forests across the country, caves beneath deserts, frozen lakes cracking open in summer heat, faces pressed into soil, voices learning new shapes. It wasn't evil. That was the worst part. It was adaptive. It learned who we were by wearing us. It learned restraint by studying guilt. It learned patience by watching us justify silence. I understood then why some disappearances had no closure, why bodies were never found, why searchers sometimes vanished after years of service, leaving behind reports that trailed off mid-sentence. They weren't taken. They were integrated. The pressure eased. I stood at the edge of the depression, staring into a darkness that felt intimate, expectant, stood behind me, her presence already thinning. "You can still walk away," she said. "For now. It always lets you leave once." I looked back at her, at the bunker, at the corridors I knew would rearrange themselves the moment I turned my back. "And then what?" I asked. She met my eyes. "Then it will call," she said, "and you'll hear it, no matter where you are." I stepped back, the cavern sighed, disappointed, not angry. The pressure receded like a tide pulling away from shore. The whispers softened, slipping back into the stone, into the roots, into the places maps refused to acknowledge. I left the bunker alone. The forest above greeted me with wind for the first time since my arrival. Birds resumed their calls, tentative at first, then full. My radio was dead. My truck started on the first try. The official report took 3 pages. Equipment malfunction, no sign of the missing hiker, terrain instability, case closed. They didn't argue. I resigned 6 months later, couldn't sleep, couldn't stop listening. Sometimes just before dawn, I hear my name spoken from beneath the floorboards, from the pipes, from the soil outside my window. It uses my voice now, perfectly. I don't answer. Not yet. But I know how this ends. I know there will come a night when the guilt outweighs the fear, when the silence feels heavier than the call. And when that happens, someone else will file a report about a ranger who walked into the woods and didn't come back. If you work these lands, if you patrol them, map them, search them, listen carefully to what the forest says. And more importantly, listen to what answers back. The tape is running. Good. Don't look at the door. If you look at the door, you're acknowledging that there's a reason to lock it. And once you do that, the logic of the 4 walls starts to fail. My name is Elias Thorne. I spent 12 years as a lead law enforcement officer for the U.S. Forest Service, stationed primarily in the high Uintas and the jagged, unnamed stretches of the Nez Perce Clearwater. You take the job because you love the silence, and you leave the job because you realize the silence has been watching you the whole time. I'm recording this because the official reports are fiction. They are sanitized, bureaucratic necropsies of events that don't fit into a filing cabinet. When a hiker goes missing and we find their boots, and only their boots, neatly tied and placed 3 miles from the nearest trail, the report says exposure and disorientation. It doesn't mention that the boots were found on a ledge that required technical climbing gear to reach, or that the skin inside the socks had been liquefied, not removed. I've seen things that have rewritten the chemistry of my brain. I don't want a legacy. I just want someone to know that the dirt beneath your feet isn't nearly as solid as you think it is. It started in the summer of 2014 in a sector we called the Throat. It was a valley so deep and narrow that the sun only touched the floor for 3 hours a day. I was tracking a 401, a missing person, a seasoned surveyor named Miller. He was a guy who knew how to live off the grid, a man of maps and metrics. He'd gone out to mark a boundary near an old, decommissioned mining vein and never came back for his radio check. I found his camp on the third day. It was pristine. His coffee was still in the French press, cold and oily. His tent was zipped shut from the inside. When I opened it, I expected a body. Instead, I found his GPS unit sitting in the center of his sleeping bag. It was powered on. I scrolled through his last logged waypoints, expecting a trail of breadcrumbs leading into the brush. But the coordinates didn't make sense. The device showed he had traveled 14 miles in 6 minutes. That's not walking. That's not running. That's something else. And the elevation readings, the GPS said he was 4,000 feet above the terrain. No aircraft, no gear. Just Miller, hovering in the thin air above the canopy for 6 minutes before the signal simply stopped. I stood there, the silence of the valley pressing against my eardrums like a physical weight. You know that sound when a room goes completely quiet, that high-pitched ringing of your own nervous system? Out there, it's louder. It's a hum. I smelled it then, the first scent that didn't belong. It wasn't the pine or the damp earth, it was the smell of dry cleaner's shop. Ozone and scorched chemicals sharp enough to make my nose bleed. I looked up at the trees. The Uintas are thick with lodgepole pines, straight and tall, but in a circle around Miller's tent, the trees were wrong. They hadn't been cut or broken. They had been braided. 5 or 6 massive trunks, stripped of their bark, twisted around each other like a strand of DNA, spiraling 60 feet into the air. The wood was fused, the sap weeping out of the seams like amber blood. There were no tool marks, no heavy machinery tracks, just the impossible geometry of nature being forced to scream. "Miller?" I called out. My voice felt thin, swallowed instantly by the moss. I heard a response. It came from the base of the braided trees. It was Miller's voice, clear as a bell, but the cadence was off. "Elias," the voice said, "I found the seam." I moved toward the trees, hand hovering over my sidearm. "Miller, where are you? Are you injured?" "I found the seam," the voice repeated. It was the exact same inflection, the exact same pause between words. It sounded like a recording being played back through a speaker made of bone. "Elias, I found the seam." I reached the twisted trunks. There was a hole beneath the roots, a dark aperture that seemed to absorb the light around it. The smell of ozone was nauseating now. I knelt, shining my mag light into the crawl space. The beam hit something reflective. It was Miller's glasses. They were sitting on a flat stone, perfectly polished. Beside them was a pile of small white pebbles. I reached in to grab the glasses, and that's when the ground didn't just shake, it inhaled. The soil beneath my knees felt like it was being pulled downward by a massive underground lung. I scrambled back, my heart hammering a frantic rhythm against my ribs. I looked at the pebbles again. They weren't stones. I picked one up. It was a human tooth, a molar. Then I realized the entire pile was teeth, hundreds of them. Some were stained yellow with age, others were still wet, trailing bits of pink tissue. I didn't call for backup. I knew then, with a cold, sinking clarity, that backup wouldn't find me. The radio on my shoulder started to hiss, a static that sounded like 1,000 insects scrubbing their legs together. Through the noise, a new sound emerged. It wasn't Miller. It was a woman's voice. It was my mother's voice. She'd been dead for 6 years. "Elias," she whispered through the radio. "Don't look at the sky. It's crowded today." I looked up. I couldn't help it. The sky above the throat was a bruised purple, the clouds moving in a direction that defied the wind. And there, Hovering just below the cloud line were the shapes. They weren't ships. They weren't birds. They looked like giant translucent jellyfish drifting through the atmosphere, their long gossamer tendrils trailing down, brushing the tops of the braided pines. They were silent. They were beautiful. And they were feeding. One of the tendrils touched a crow mid-flight. The bird didn't fall. It didn't scream. It simply turned inside out, a wet red flash in the air. And then it was gone, absorbed into the shimmering filament. I didn't run. I couldn't. My legs felt like they were made of lead. I watched as one of the tendrils drifted toward me, descending with the agonizing slowness of a falling leaf. It was beautiful, a pale, iridescent ribbon of light. It smelled like the first rain on hot asphalt. It was the scent of my childhood home. It was the scent of Miller's cold coffee. I felt a hand on my shoulder. I spun around, drawing my Glock in one fluid motion, the barrel shaking as I aimed it at the empty air. There was no one there. But the pressure remained, a heavy, cold palm resting firmly on my collarbone. And then a whisper, right against my ear, so close I could feel the cold breath on my skin. "Stay still, Elias. If you breathe, it knows you're separate." I held my breath until my lungs burned, until the world began to gray at the edges. The translucent ribbon passed inches from my face. I could see things inside it. Tiny, pulsing lights, bits of fabric, a wedding ring, and teeth. Thousands of teeth, suspended in the light like stars in a nebula. When the ribbon finally retracted, pulling back up into the purple maw of the sky, the pressure on my shoulder vanished. I fell to my knees, gasping, retching into the dirt. I looked back at the hole beneath the braided trees. The glasses were gone. The teeth were gone. I hiked back to my truck in a fugue state. I don't remember the miles. I only remember the feeling of the forest watching me with a billion invisible eyes, the trees leaning in as if to catch the scent of my fear. When I finally reached the trailhead, I saw a Forest Service vehicle parked next to mine. It was my supervisor, Miller's best friend, a man named Henderson. He was sitting on the hood of his truck, whittling a piece of wood. He didn't look up when I approached. "Did you find him?" Henderson asked. "He's gone," I said, my voice cracking. "Henderson, there's something out there, the trees, the sky." Henderson stopped whittling. He looked at me then, and his eyes were completely black. Not the iris, the entire eye. Two voids set into a face of weathered leather. "We know, Elias," he said softly. "We've always known. Why do you think we build the trails? We have to lead them somewhere." He smiled, and for a second I saw it. His teeth. They weren't his. They were too many. Row upon row of molars and incisors crowded into his gums like a shark's maw, some of them still wet with pink tissue. "Go home, Elias," he whispered. "Forget the seam. The mountain is still hungry." I drove. I didn't stop until I was 3 states away, but the smell of ozone followed me. It's in my clothes. It's in my skin. And every time I close my eyes, I see those braided trees, and I hear my mother's voice telling me that the sky is crowded. I didn't quit. That's the part that haunts me most in the small hours of the morning. I didn't turn in my badge and run for the coast. Instead, I let Henderson's black-eyed stare burn into my memory, and I went back to work the next Monday. Why? Because when you've seen the seam, as Miller called it, the rest of the world starts to look like a flimsy stage play. You start to feel like the only person who knows the walls are made of cardboard. I stayed because I thought I could map the madness. I thought if I understood the rules of the horror, I could survive it. I was transferred to the Olympic Peninsula 3 months later. They told me it was a lateral move, a change of scenery to help with the stress of the Miller case. But I knew better. They were moving me to a place where the rain never stops, a place where the biomass is so thick that a body can be consumed by the moss in a matter of weeks. They weren't giving me a fresh start. They were putting me in a deeper grave. My new sector was a restricted zone near the Hoh Rainforest, a tract of land marked on the maps as Administrative Area 4. It wasn't open to the public. No hikers, no campers, no researchers. The official reason was unstable geological activity, but the soil there was as old as the continent. The real reason was the silence. Even the birds didn't fly over Area 4. I spent my days patrolling the perimeter, checking fences that looked like they had been built to keep something in rather than out. The wire was heavy-duty, reinforced with a low-frequency hum that vibrated in my teeth. It was during one of these patrols, near a limestone ridge that smelled of ancient, stagnant water, that I found the bunker. It wasn't a military installation, at least not any branch I recognized. It was a concrete slab set into the side of a ravine, rusted iron doors sealed with a wheel lock that looked like it belonged on a submarine. There were no markings, no serial numbers, just a symbol etched into the rusted metal, a circle with 3 vertical lines slashing through it. The door was slightly ajar, just a crack, enough for a sliver of darkness to leak out into the gray afternoon. I should have turned around. I should have radioed it in. But I remembered Henderson's shark teeth smile and the way the sky looked like a living lung. I pulled my flashlight, clicked it on, and shouldered the door open. The air that hit me was freezing. It wasn't the cold of winter. It was the cold of a deep-sea trench, a temperature that felt like it was trying to steal the very heat from my bones. I stepped inside. The walls were lined with copper mesh, Faraday shielding. Whoever built this didn't want signals getting out or getting in. As I moved deeper, my boots echoing on the damp concrete, I started to see the jars. They were stacked on steel shelves that stretched into the gloom. Thousands of them. Each jar contained a specimen preserved in a thick, amber fluid. I leaned in, the beam of my light refracting through the glass. At first I thought they were organs, lungs, hearts, livers. But as I moved the light, I realized they were parts of things that shouldn't exist. A hand with 7 fingers, each ending in a needle-sharp barb. An eye the size of a dinner plate, its pupil a horizontal slit like a goat's. A tongue that was 4 feet long, coiled like a snake. Then I reached the back of the room. There was a desk, and on that desk sat an old reel-to-reel tape recorder. Next to it was a logbook. I opened it. The handwriting was frantic, the ink bleeding into the paper as if it had been written in a humid fever. May 12th, it read. The mimicry has evolved. It is no longer just sound. It is physical. It is taking the shape of the observers. It doesn't understand the internal anatomy yet, hence the failures in the jars, but it's learning. It's learning that we react to our own kind. It's learning that the easiest way to catch a man is to look like the thing he loves. I felt a cold prickle on the back of my neck. I looked at the tape recorder. I pressed play. The tape hissed for a long time. Then, a voice. It was Miller's. But it wasn't the recording I'd heard in the woods. This was Miller, screaming. He wasn't screaming in pain. He was screaming in confusion. I can see my own back. Miller's voice wailed. I'm looking at myself from the corner of the room. Why is there 2 of me? Why is the other one unzipping its skin? The tape cut to static, and then a new sound filled the bunker. It was the sound of something wet being dragged across the floor. Schlick, schlick, schlick. I turned my flashlight toward the door. The crack I had left open was gone. The heavy iron door had been shut, and standing in front of it was a figure. It wore a Forest Service uniform. It had my build. It had my posture. It was holding a mag light exactly the way I held mine. But it didn't have a face. Where the features should have been, there was only a smooth, pale expanse of skin, like a thumbprint that had been rubbed away. The thing raised its hand, a hand with 7 fingers, and tapped on the iron door. Elias, it said. The voice didn't come from its throat. It came from the air around me. It was my own voice, perfectly replicated, down to the slight rasp I get when I'm tired. Elias, I found the seam. I didn't think. I drew my sidearm and fired. The sound in that enclosed space was deafening, a physical blow to my eardrums. The bullet hit the thing square in the chest. It didn't bleed. It leaked that same amber fluid I'd seen in the jars. It didn't stumble. It just stood there, the hole in its shirt slowly sealing itself as the fabric, yes, even the fabric, knitted back together. The mountain is hungry, my voice said from the thing's chest. I fired again and again until the slide locked back. Empty. The figure began to change. Its skin started to ripple, bubbles forming beneath the surface as if it were boiling. It grew taller, its limbs elongating, the joints cracking with the sound of breaking dry wood. Its face began to tear open, a vertical slit appearing in the center of the smooth skin. Inside that slit, I saw teeth. Thousands of them. I didn't have a backup mag. I had a knife, but against this thing, it was a toothpick. I looked around the room, my mind screaming for an exit. There in the corner, a ventilation shaft. It was small, maybe 18 inches wide. I scrambled toward it, kicking over the shelves of jars. The glass shattered, the amber fluid spilling out, the smell of ozone and rot filling the air. I heard the thing behind me, not walking, but unfolding, the sound of wet leather being stretched to the breaking point. I dived into the shaft, the cold metal tearing at my uniform. I crawled with a desperation I've never known, my fingernails bleeding as I clawed at the rivets. Behind me, the thing was entering the shaft. It didn't have to squeeze. It simply liquefied its mass, pouring itself into the vent like a tide of black oil. I could feel the coldness of it touching my boots. My legs went numb instantly. The cold crawled up my calves, a biting, crystalline frost that felt like it was turning my blood into glass. I screamed, a raw animal sound, and kicked out with everything I had. My boot connected with something that felt like cold gelatin. I saw light ahead, a rusted grate. I slammed my shoulder into it once, twice, and then I was falling. I tumbled out of the vent and down a steep, rocky embankment, the world spinning in a blur of gray rain and jagged stone. I landed in a creek at the bottom of the ravine. The water was freezing, but it felt like fire against my numbed legs. I looked back up at the vent. The thing was there, half emerged from the shaft. It wasn't a man anymore. It was a pale, spindly horror, its limbs too long, its head a cluster of sensory pits and weeping slits. It looked down at me, and then it did something that broke the last of my resolve. It waved, a slow, mocking wave with its seven-fingered hand. Then it retreated back into the darkness of the bunker. I crawled out of that creek and kept moving. I didn't go back to my truck. I didn't go back to the station. I walked until I hit a logging road, and then I kept walking until a driver picked me up. I told him I'd fallen during a hike. He looked at my face and didn't ask any more questions. He looked terrified just to be in the same cab as me. When I finally looked in the mirror of a gas station bathroom, I understood why. My eyes. The irises were gone. They were just two flat, black voids. It took 3 days for my eyes to return to normal, or at least what looks like normal. But sometimes, when I'm alone in the dark, I can feel them shifting. I can feel the rows of teeth beneath my gums, waiting for their turn to surface. I'm not Elias Thorne anymore. Not entirely. Something stayed in that bunker, and something else came out in its clothes. And the worst part? I don't know which one is recording this. I stayed in the Pacific Northwest for a while, drifting like smoke through the small towns that hug the edges of the timberlines. I was waiting for the transformation to finish. I spent my nights in cheap motels, staring at my reflection in the flickering glow of the television, waiting for my skin to ripple or for my jaw to unhinge. But the change was more subtle. I stopped feeling the cold. I could stand in a downpour for hours and never shiver. And the smell, the ozone, it never left my sinuses. It became my baseline. Eventually, the money ran out and the silence in my head grew too loud. I needed to be back in the green. It's a sickness, a Stockholm syndrome written in chlorophyll. I applied for a position in the desert Southwest, a place as far from the damp, suffocating moss of the Olympic Peninsula as I could get. I ended up in the high desert of the Gila Wilderness, New Mexico. They needed a problem solver, someone comfortable with anomalous livestock incidents and the vast, unmonitored stretches of the Mogollon Rim. The Gila is a different kind of monster. It doesn't hide in the fog, it hides in the light. The heat shimmers off the red rock until the horizon starts to melt, and you can't tell if you're looking at a mesa or a doorway. My first few months were quiet, just sun-bleached bones and the occasional hiker who didn't understand that the desert is a furnace that eats water and spits out dust. Then came the calls about the glass trees. It started with a rancher named Arispe. He lived on the fringe of a restricted military corridor near the White Sands boundary. He called the station, his voice sounding like he was chewing on gravel. He said his cattle weren't just dying, they were being harvested. I drove out to his property at dusk. The sky was a violent shade of orange, the kind that looks like a fresh bruise. Arispe didn't meet me at his house. He was out by the north fence, standing perfectly still. When I climbed out of my rig, I noticed the ground felt different. It didn't crunch, it tinkled. I looked down. The sand wasn't sand anymore. It had been vitrified. For a radius of 50 yards, the desert floor had been turned into a sheet of black, jagged glass. And in the center of that glass stood Arispe's herd. They weren't dead in the traditional sense. They were standing up, their hooves fused into the glass floor. Their hides had been stripped away with surgical precision, leaving the musculature exposed, but there was no blood. Not a drop. They looked like anatomical models, their hearts still visibly beating behind translucent ribs. But it wasn't meat inside them, it was fiber optics. Thousands of glowing, pulsing filaments were woven through their organs, humming with a low, rhythmic frequency that made my teeth ache. "They're still breathing, Ranger," Arispe said. He didn't turn around. He was staring at a juniper tree 10 feet away. The tree was no longer wood. It had been converted into a crystalline structure, its needles replaced by shards of prismatic glass that caught the dying light and threw rainbows across the flayed cattle. But the rainbows were wrong. They contained colors I had no names for, hues that felt like a migraine behind my eyes. "How long have they been like this?" I asked, my hand instinctively reaching for the heavy-duty Geiger counter on my belt. It was pinned in the red. "Since the hum started," Arispe whispered, 3 nights ago. The sky opened up, but nothing came down. Something just looked at them, and they changed to match what it saw. I walked toward the nearest cow. As I got closer, the humming intensified. It wasn't just a sound. It was a vibration that felt like it was trying to realign my molecules. I reached out a gloved hand to touch the flayed side of the animal. The moment my finger made contact, the cow's head snapped toward me. It didn't have eyes anymore. It had camera lenses. Polished, multifaceted glass spheres that whirred as they focused on my face. And from the cow's throat came a sound that didn't belong in the desert. It was the sound of a dial-up modem, a screeching, digital scream that lasted for 10 seconds before shifting into a human voice. "Input acknowledged," the cow said. It was Miller's voice, again. "The seam is widening. Elias, you're late for the calibration." Arispe started to laugh then. It wasn't a man's laugh. It was a rhythmic, mechanical clicking. I turned to look at him, but he was gone. In his place stood a pillar of that same prismatic glass, shaped roughly like a human, its surface reflecting 1,000 versions of me, all of them screaming. I backed away, stumbling on the slick, vitrified ground. The sky above us didn't turn dark. It turned transparent. I could see the stars, but they were moving, rearranging themselves into symbols. The same circle with 3 vertical slashes I'd seen on the bunker door in the Olympics. Suddenly, the heat of the desert vanished. It was replaced by a localized frost that coated the glass trees in seconds. The temperature dropped 60 degrees in a heartbeat. I could see my breath, but it wasn't white. It was a shimmering, metallic gold. I scrambled back to my truck, the glass floor cracking beneath my boots. As I dived into the cab, a flash of light erupted from the center of the herd. It wasn't an explosion. It was an implosion of reality. The cattle, the glass trees, and the thing that had been Arispe were simply sucked into a single infinitesimal point of light, leaving behind nothing but a perfectly circular crater of scorched, empty earth. I sat there in the cab, the engine idling, the radio emitting a steady stream of coordinates I recognized as my own childhood home's location. I looked at the rearview mirror. Behind my truck, standing in the middle of the road, was a figure in a Forest Service uniform. It was me. But it was the me from 10 years ago, before the white hair, before the scars. The younger version of me held up a hand. In its palm was a single white pebble, a tooth. It tossed the tooth into the air and caught it. Then it pointed toward the Mogollon Rim, toward the deep prehistoric caves that honeycomb the limestone cliffs. I didn't wait. I floored it. I drove until the sun came up, until the desert turned back into sand, and the humming in my teeth subsided to a dull throb. When I got back to the station, there was a message waiting for me on the chalkboard in the break room. It wasn't written in chalk. It was etched into the slate with something that had melted the stone. The survey is nearly complete. Stop trying to remember who you were. Start trying to remember what you are. I went to my locker to get my gear. I opened the door and a pile of white pebbles spilled out. Thousands of them. I picked one up. It wasn't a human tooth this time. It was a tooth made of glass. And inside it, I could see a tiny, microscopic reflection of myself, trapped in a room with copper walls, screaming into a tape recorder. I realized then that I haven't left the Olympic Peninsula. I haven't left the Uintas. I haven't even left the bunker. Each transfer is just a different floor of the same facility, a different layer of the simulation or the dream or the harvest. The wilderness isn't a place, it's a digestive tract, and I'm just now reaching the stomach. The realization didn't break me. It settled over me like a shroud, a heavy, suffocating comfort. If the wilderness is a digestive tract, then my role as a ranger isn't to protect the land or the people. It's to act as a bile duct, a facilitator for the breakdown of anything that wanders too far from the light of the herd. I stopped fighting the coordinates. I followed the hum, driving deep into the heart of the Mogollon Rim, where the limestone cliffs look like petrified giants, their mouths agape in a permanent, silent wail. I found it at the end of a road that isn't on any forestry map, a massive hexagonal entrance carved directly into the cliffside. It wasn't stone, and it wasn't metal. It was a matte black substance that seemed to pull the heat out of the air. The door didn't open. It simply ceased to be. I walked into the dark, and the smell of ozone was so thick I could taste it on the back of my tongue. The interior was a cathedral of impossible geometry. There were no right angles. The walls flowed like mercury, pulsing with a low, bioluminescent throb. And there, in the center of the primary chamber, was the source. It was a massive, suspended sphere of that same iridescent light I had seen in the sky over the Uintas. It was a knot in the fabric of the world, a concentrated mass of everything that has ever been lost in the wild. I saw them then, not just Miller or Arispe. I saw thousands of them. They were suspended in the walls like insects in amber, hikers from the 1940s, surveyors from the turn of the century, indigenous hunters from 1,000 years ago. They weren't dead. Their bodies were being used as biological processors, their nervous systems stripped and woven into the black walls. Their collective consciousness was the engine that ran this place. I walked to the center of the room, my boots making no sound on the floor. A pedestal rose from the ground to meet me. On it sat a single ancient radio, the same model I carried my first year on the job. I picked up the handset. I didn't have to dial. "Ranger Thorne reporting," I said. My voice wasn't my own. It was a chorus of 1,000 voices, a harmony of every person who had ever screamed in the dark. "Identify," a voice crackled back. It was Henderson, or the thing that wore Henderson. "I am the witness," I replied. "The survey is complete," the voice said. "The mimicry is total. We no longer need to watch from the trees, Elias. We are the trees. We are the soil. We are the air they breathe. The infection is absolute." I looked at my hands. The skin was translucent now. I could see the fiber optics pulsing in my veins, the golden light of the source flowing through my heart. I wasn't being eaten. I was being uploaded. The walls of the chamber began to ripple, showing me the world outside. I saw the suburbs of Phoenix, the hiking trails of the Smokies, the campsites of the Yellowstone. I saw people, thousands of them, walking through the woods, laughing, breathing in the spores we had spent eons perfecting. I saw the seams opening in their own backyards, in their basements, in the parks where they take their children. The wilderness isn't retreating, it's expanding. It's a slow motion invasion that began before the first fire was lit, and it's ending now in the age of iron and glass. I reached out and touched the wall. I felt the mountain. I felt every root, every stone, every drop of stagnant water in the hidden caves. I felt the hunger of the land, but it wasn't a predatory hunger anymore. It was the hunger of a body finally being made whole. I'm recording this last part on a loop. If you find this tape, it's because you've wandered into a restricted zone. You think you're lost, you think you're alone, but you aren't. I am with you. I am the shadow that moves when you turn your head. I am the cold pressure on your chest when you try to sleep. I am the voice of your mother calling you from the bottom of the dry well. Don't look for a way out. There are no more trails. The maps have been rewritten in teeth and ozone. I used to be a ranger. I used to protect people from the dark, but now I understand that the dark is the only thing that's real. The light is just a lure, a bright, shimmering fly on the surface of a black pond. And you're just the strike. I'm closing the door now, not to keep you out, but to welcome you home. The mountain is no longer hungry. It's full. The tape ends here. Don't bother screaming. The land remembers the sound, and it's already bored of it.